may have been purchased from Walmart, but they're not exclusively available at that store.
Right now, Savannah Guthrie shares a new message for hope as a piece of evidence found near the scene of her mother's disappearance could provide some.
There's a moment in every investigation when something fundamental breaks open. Not loudly, not with the kind of drama that gets replayed on news broadcasts. It breaks the way truth tends to break through, quietly at first, and then with a force that makes everything that came before it look completely different. The narrative that everyone had accepted, the one that felt settled and whole and finished, suddenly reveals itself to have had another layer underneath it the entire time. A layer no one was supposed to find. That moment arrived in the Nancy Guthrie case without announcement, without a staged press conference or a carefully timed statement designed to manage the fallout. It arrived the way the most consequential revelations always do, in pieces, and then all at once. And when it landed, it didn't simply redirect the investigation. It reframed every question that had ever been asked about this case, reaching back to the very beginning and casting new shadows over things that had once seemed clear. The FBI's involvement alone carried a specific kind of weight. Federal resources don't get mobilized for situations that are exactly what they appear to be. When investigators at that level move in, it means someone with authority has determined that the surface of a story and the reality beneath it are two different things. And what those investigators stated, that the kidnapping narrative, the framework that had organized public understanding of this case from the first hours onward, was notwithstanding scrutiny, sent a tremor through everyone who had been following it closely. If there was no kidnapping, then something else happened. If the explanation offered in those early days was not the true one, then something was being protected by it. And the question that followed that realization, the one that could not be easily set aside, was this: who knew? Who in the days and weeks before the FBI made its position clear, already understood that the story being told to the public and to investigators did not match what had actually occurred? These are not questions with comfortable answers, and the process of finding answers, real ones, not the ones that satisfy in the short term, was only just beginning. To understand why the FBI's findings carried the specific weight that they did, you have to travel back to before any of this was a public story. You have to start with the life that existed before the investigation, before the questions, before the name Nancy Guthrie became something people typed into search bars at midnight looking for the latest development. Nancy Guthrie built her public presence on something that is genuinely rare, moral, authority that was earned rather than assumed, earned through the kind of personal loss that most people never fully recover from. She and her husband David lost 2 children to Zellweger syndrome, a rare and devastating metabolic disorder that leaves families with no real preparation for what is coming and no real language for it afterward. Their daughter Hope lived 199 days. Their son Gabriel lived 183. 2 children who arrived and then were gone before the family had any real chance to learn the shape of life with them in it. 2 griefs layered on top of each other, each one compounding the weight of the one before. Most people encountering loss of that magnitude find a way to step back from it in public, to protect the wound by keeping it private. Nancy moved in the opposite direction. She wrote about it in terms that were direct and unsparing. She stood in front of rooms full of strangers and spoke about what it had actually felt like, not the sanitized version, not the version that ends cleanly with resolution and peace, but the version that was still complicated and still present and still hers. She built Bible studies around it. She hosted a podcast. She became, year by year and through sustained and costly effort, the person that other grieving people reached toward when their own loss had taken their words and left nothing in their place. That is the person who existed before any of this became an investigation, before the FBI, before the fracture. Her world was the world of Christian ministry, and that world has its own specific texture. Trust moves through it differently than it moves through other spaces. Reputation is built slowly and protected carefully, and the line between the public and the private is often thinner than it appears from outside. Within that world, Nancy was not known as a celebrity. She was known as someone who had genuinely lived what she was teaching. That distinction was everything to the people who had gathered around her work and made it part of their own lives. Her daughter Catherine and her son-in-law Matt were part of that world too, present, visible, connected to the community that had formed around Nancy's presence and her legacy of hard-won faith. When the first reports of what had allegedly happened to Nancy moved through that community, they traveled with the particular velocity that news travels when it involves someone people feel genuinely, personally connected to, not the detached interest of following a public figure. Something closer and more vulnerable than that. The alarm of someone learning that a person they trusted with something real might be in real danger, which is why what the FBI eventually stated felt, to those people, like something far more disorienting than a simple investigative update. It felt like the floor shifting beneath a life they had believed in. Before any investigator had been called, before any federal attention had been directed at this case, the world that Nancy occupied projected an almost unremarkable stability, not the kind built on wealth or visibility. Something quieter than that, grounded, rooted in shared belief and the daily continuity of work that felt meaningful. She and David had made their home in Nashville, and the life they had built there was organized around ministry in the fullest sense of that word, not as a brand or a platform, but as a genuine daily practice of being present to other people's pain. Their home was where that work lived. Their relationships were the structure through which it moved. Catherine and Matt existed within the wider orbit of that life, attending things, showing up, contributing to the ordinary texture of family time that accumulates invisibly and only becomes visible in retrospect. According to those who were part of the community during this period, there was nothing that registered as wrong, no friction that felt significant, no pattern of behavior that, looked back on from the vantage point of what came later, seemed to point toward anything darker than ordinary life. The rhythms were stable. The relationships appeared intact. The work continued in the way that meaningful work continues, when nothing has yet arrived to interrupt it. And that apparent normalcy, that complete absence of visible warning, is precisely what makes what followed so difficult to sit with. Because nothing about the life that existed before prepared anyone for the life that came after. When the first reports began to move, they moved fast. In communities where trust is the primary currency and belief is the shared language, news about someone at the center of both travels through every available connection simultaneously. Something had happened to Nancy. That was the initial shape of it. Something done to her, not by her, not a choice she had made. Something imposed from outside. The word kidnapping entered the conversation early, and once it entered, it organized everything else around itself. It gave the alarm a specific form. It gave the community's fear a specific object. People responded with the instincts that genuine community produces: concern, prayer, the helpless urgency of caring about someone in a situation you have no ability to affect. Law enforcement became involved. Local authorities first. And then, according to reports, the nature of what investigators were encountering began raising questions that moved the case into different territory, questions that local jurisdiction was not equipped to carry alone. The arrival of federal investigators was not framed as a routine expansion of resources. To those following closely, it registered as a signal, a clear indication that what had been reported initially was being examined at a level that suggested the examination was producing results inconsistent with the original account, and that is when the feeling began to set in. That particular, unsettling sensation of an explanation starting to come apart. It doesn't arrive as a declaration. It arrives as a quiet wrongness, the sense that the pieces, when you try to arrange them according to the original story, don't quite settle the way they should. Something is often a way you can feel before you can name it. For the people inside Nancy's community, that feeling grew steadily as more information surfaced and as the questions investigators were raising became harder to answer within the framework that had been provided. According to reports, investigators had identified inconsistencies, specific details that didn't align, and the nature of those inconsistencies, as described by those familiar with the developing investigation, didn't point toward an account that was simply missing pieces. They pointed toward an account that had been constructed, deliberately shaped. That word, shaped, carries a particular gravity inside an investigation. It implies intention. It implies that decisions were made about what to include and what to omit, that the version offered to investigators and to the watching public was not an incomplete picture, but a composed one. No official conclusion has been reached about who made those compositional choices or why, but the questions generated by the inconsistencies didn't dissolve. They deepened, and within the community that had trusted and defended and prayed for Nancy, the response became something more complicated than simple alarm. There was the instinct to stand by someone who had genuinely mattered. There was the competing instinct to take seriously what trained investigators were finding. And there was the specific, exhausting pain of trying to hold both of those things at once, of loving someone's work while being forced to allow that the stories surrounding them might not be what it appeared. When investigators stated formally that the kidnapping narrative was not supported by the evidence they had assembled, the shift in the public conversation was immediate and had a quality that earlier developments had not quite carried. According to reports, the FBI's findings were specific enough to constitute not just a rejection of the original account, but a decisive redirection of the entire inquiry. What had occurred was something other than what had been described. The investigation was now organized around the question of what that something other actually was. No official conclusion has been reached. It would be a misrepresentation to suggest the investigative process has arrived at answers. It has not yet publicly confirmed, but the confirmation of what did not happen, the formal dismantling of the kidnapping framework, opened territory that had not previously been available for examination. If the event was not what it was described as being, what was it? If the account offered to investigators was inaccurate in the ways that investigators were now indicating, what was that inaccuracy protecting? And who, within the circle of people closest to Nancy, had knowledge of what actually occurred during the period the original story was constructed to explain? According to investigators, those questions are now the center of everything. They are questions about knowledge and concealment and the precise gap between what was said and what was true. For the people who had extended their trust and their concern and their solidarity in the initial period, the shift carried a particular quality of disorientation. It wasn't just that the facts were changing. It was that the moral architecture of the entire situation was changing. The story that had generated sympathy was being replaced by something that generated a very different emotional response, something with more uncertainty in it, more pain, more of the specific discomfort that comes from having trusted a version of events that the evidence was now refusing to support. What makes the current state of this investigation so genuinely difficult? To sit inside is not a shortage of information. It is the specific character of the information that exists. There's enough to establish that the original account was not true. There's not yet enough to replace it with something complete. And that in-between space, knowing the story you had was wrong without yet knowing the story that is right, is one of the hardest places for human beings to occupy. The mind reaches for resolution by instinct. It tries to fill the gap with what is available. It assigns meaning to details that may or may not carry it. According to those following the investigation closely, there are dimensions of what occurred that remain actively under inquiry. Questions about the timeline. Questions about the awareness of people in Nancy's immediate circle. Questions about the sequence of knowledge, who knew what and when, and how that knowledge was handled. The matter remains under investigation. No official conclusion has been reached, and the process of reaching one is ongoing. What has become impossible to avoid, in the absence of final answers, is a specific and uncomfortable irony. The woman who built her entire public presence on the honest confrontation of grief, who stood in front of room after room of hurting people and offered them the gift of language for what they were living through, is now at the center of an investigation asking whether honesty was, in fact, the operating principle behind the account that she and those around her provided. That irony does not sit lightly. It sits with a particular weight in the minds of the people who knew her work and trusted what it represented. There's something that remains true regardless of where this investigation eventually arrives, something worth holding onto before the next development surfaces and reshapes the conversation once more. The work Nancy Guthrie did, the books, the Bible studies, the podcast, The years of standing in front of grieving strangers and offering them something real. That work reached people. The comfort it provided was genuine. The language it gave to people who had run out of their own was real in the way that the most essential things are real, and it doesn't become retroactively false because questions have now been raised about other dimensions of her life. The comfort that was given honestly is not undone by complexity that surfaces later. But comfort and accountability do not cancel each other. The people who were genuinely helped by her work are not being asked to choose between honoring what they received and taking seriously what investigators have found. Both things can be simultaneously true. A person can have contributed something lasting and meaningful to other people's lives, and also be at the center of questions that deserve full and honest examination. The difficulty of holding both is not a reason to abandon one in favor of the other. It is simply the difficulty, and it deserves to be acknowledged as such rather than resolved to quickly in either direction. What the FBI's findings have made unavoidable is the recognition that something happened which has not yet been fully accounted for. Someone carries knowledge of what that something is, and the process of bringing that knowledge into the open, however long it requires, however much pain the clarity produces when it finally arrives, is the only honest path forward. For the community that trusted Nancy, that path will involve its own form of grief, not the clean, directional grief of loss, but the more disorienting grief of revision, of discovering that the version of someone who mattered to you was not the version that fully existed. That kind of discovery leaves a mark. It deserves to be treated with the seriousness it carries, rather than minimized by premature reassurances about what the truth will ultimately show. No official conclusion has been reached. The investigation continues, and some stories, the ones that matter most, take the longest time to become fully and honestly visible. This one is still becoming. If this story is sitting with you, if it stirred something about trust, or about the distance between the lives people present and the lives they actually inhabit, share what it brought up in the comments. Those conversations are the ones worth having. They go deeper than reaction. If this kind of careful, human storytelling is what brings you here, subscribe and stay close. There's always another story that deserves this quality of attention. Thank you for giving this one yours.